I think there's huge problems with epidemiology. So epidemiology, observational studies, are studies that look at a certain group of people and then try to draw inferences from their behavior about associations with disease. So let's say we take a group and we look and see, how much saturated fat are they eating, and we separate them into, low consumption, medium consumption, high consumption. And in a prospective study where we're watching them over time, we might then look 20 years later and see how many people had heart attacks and died. Okay, and then we try to, correlate that with their amount of saturated fat intake. Now, I actually just published 2 articles with going in detail on the problems with observational nutritional research. And you can find them at kesser.co/rogan. There's a whole bunch of information that we're going to be talking about today there, so people can go and get the details themselves. But I'll just give you 3 of the worst problems with nutritional epidemiology. The first is data collection. So there's a saying in science, which is that data are only as good as the tool used to collect them. All right. And in nutritional observational studies, the tool used to collect data is a questionnaire. Okay. And so that relies completely on memory. And we know that memory is not a precise, accurate, or literal representation of events. It's more like a highly edited anecdote of what happened in the past. And
it's a little bit like the Kavanaugh thing going on right now.
Back in the 13th century, you had Francis Bacon who said, for something to be scientific, it has to be independently observable, measurable, and falsifiable, and then accurate and valid. And so let's use an analogy. If you're sitting there eating an apple, and I'm watching you do that, I can observe that you're eating the apple, I can measure how much of the apple you eat, and I can confirm or refute that you're eating the apple. If you tell me that you were eating an apple 15 years ago or 10 years ago, I obviously can't observe that, I obviously can't measure it, and I obviously can't confirm or refute it. And yet our entire foundation of nutritional epidemiology is based on that. Basically, people reporting on what they ate at some time in the past. So, how much of a problem is this? There's a guy named Edward Archer who's done some really interesting studies, and he looked at the NHANES data, the nurses' health data, which is one of the longest running nutrition studies, 39 years. And he found that the self-reported calorie intake in those studies was either physiologically implausible or incompatible with life. So the average person in those studies reported a calorie intake that would not support an elderly, bedridden, frail woman.
So it's just inaccurate.
It's completely inaccurate. And the people who are most likely to underreport are people who are overweight and obese. So if calories are that much underreported, all nutrition comes through calories. Everything we get, fat, protein, carbohydrates, micronutrients, they all come through calories. So if calories are that underreported, that completely invalidates the data set.
So this is an obesity study. So they're underreported because of shame?
It's not an obesity study. No? It's just Americans are overweight and obese. The majority of Americans are overweight and obese. So in any data set of Americans, you're going to have the majority of them overweight or obese. Or obese. So that's the first problem. The second problem is the healthy user bias, which I know we talked about before, but it's basically the idea that because when someone engages in a behavior that's perceived as unhealthy, they are more likely to engage in other behaviors that are perceived as unhealthy, and vice versa. So let's say you do a study of people who eat more red meat. Well, red meat has been perceived as unhealthy for a long time. And so what we know is that in those observational studies, the people who eat more red meat are also smoking more, they have higher body mass index, they're eating fewer fruits and vegetables, they have a lower level of education, they're less physically active. So how do you know that it's the red meat that's causing the problem and not those other things? You don't, because they cannot control for all of those potential confounding factors. The third problem with observational research, and maybe the biggest, is that the relative risks in nutrition are so low that they're indistinguishable from chance. So in fields outside of nutrition and epidemiology, nobody would consider a relative risk, an increase in risk less than 100%, a doubling, to be really worth paying attention to. So to put this in perspective, the observational studies that Joel was referring to that confirm that that cigarette smoking led to lung cancer, that showed between a 1,000 and 3,000% increase in lung cancer in smokers. Okay, and the studies that have shown that eating aflatoxin, which is a mycotoxin, increased liver cancer risk, that's 600% increase. Okay, the IARC, the WHO report that suggested that processed red meat was a carcinogen, that was 18% increase. Most epidemiologists you talk to will say that is so low that it's really indistinguishable from chance, especially given the healthy user bias and the problems with the data collection that I mentioned before.
So the studies that are cited, so when people are talking about red meat causes cancer, they're literally talking about something that showed an 18% increase.
Yeah.
And this is over people that are also consuming sugar.
So that translates into 4.5. There were 4.5 cases of cancer out of 100 in people with no lowest intake of processed meat, and that went up to 5.3 cases out of 100 in people with the highest intake of processed meat. So, there are quotes like if you look even 20 years ago, like there's an article in Science, the journal Science, and Marcia Angell, who was the former editor of New England Journal of Medicine, was quoted as saying, "We wouldn't even accept a paper for publication if it didn't have at least a 200% increase, especially if it was a new association or the biological mechanism wasn't known." And here we are today saying that, this increased that by 7% or by 10%. And when you consider that the data is usually questionnaires of what people ate and all of these confounding factors like exercise and fruit and vegetable consumption and things like that are not accounted for, then we're really just playing games with numbers.
Is part of the problem as well that there's this clickbait culture now in terms of journalism where they just want to publish something that says a study shows 18% of people eat red meat get cancer.
That's a huge problem. And there was a study that was done that showed that 43% of findings came from observational studies were portrayed in the media as being causal, which any epidemiologist would tell you that that's a faux pas. You can't do that. But nobody is going to click on a headline that says, small association between these two variables seen. We don't know what it means, but please read the story. It's really interesting.